minerality definitely impacts the flavor, but I think it also impacts the texture. And this wine, to me, although it has a lot of flavor, it's mostly about texture. It doesn't have tannins, but it has this grip that I think comes from minerality and also the high acid. You feel it, caresses your palate. And then because of the acidity, you get this like mouth-watering sensation right after you swallow. And the wine just lasts. You can really taste it for like minutes.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 206. Is minerality a flavor or a texture in wine? And what does it feel or taste like? Why do wines made from some hybrid grapes deserve your attention? And what can winemakers learn from Jimi Hendrix? You'll hear those tips and stories in part 2 of my chat with Aleks Zecevic, who hosts the Vintners podcast. You don't have to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but I hope you'll go back if you missed it after you finish this one. Now a quick update on my upcoming wine memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. So in mysteries and thrillers, suspense usually comes from action. It could be a car chase, the hero entering a room about to be clubbed over the head by a villain, or bullets flying through the air in a shootout. In most memoirs, including mine, there aren't these heart-pounding sequences. However, in memoir, dialogue is action. Why? Because it's often rapid fire with sentences that are shorter on average than others in the book, and that gives a sense of momentum, sort of a back and forth rally between characters, as though you're watching a verbal tennis match. On the page, visually, it's also very racy because there's a lot of white space. So each sentence or fragment a character says has its own line, so there tends to be very few thick paragraphs of text. As a reader, you can whip through these pages and feel the satisfaction of motoring through the book. The only risk with dialogue is when it becomes stilted or expository, and I'll explain what I mean by that next week. In the meantime, here's a review from Kim Wells, a beta reader from Newfoundland. Is this a great title or what? I will take Wine Witch over Wine Babe or Wine Mommy any day of the week. If you think this is only a book about wine, then you're mistaken. It is much more than that. This is an honest, hilarious, and touching memoir from Natalie McLean, which at times made me angry on her behalf. I related to her feelings of being the recipient of mansplaining and patronizing behavior, and of being underestimated. The online witch hunt she experienced is a timely and important subject, and most readers can probably relate to the experience of being targeted on social media with sexist, angry, or inappropriate messages, although not to the degree the author experienced. But lest you get the impression that this memoir is a downer or an account from a man-hater, let me correct that immediately. It is actually brimming with good humor and optimism, describing her journey from emotionally draining and painful life experiences to finding her place in the world again with renewed self-confidence, close family ties, and the support of a good partner. I really appreciated the author's honesty in this memoir, and for me, that is the valuable piece of reading a well-written memoir. It reminds me to face my own problems and demons with clear eyes and equal honesty. I enjoyed this book immensely. 5 stars. Thank you, Kim. That means a lot to me. I've posted a link to a blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/206. And this is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. If you want a more intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at the manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. Okay, on with the show. You have one more interesting story about someone in, it's Styria, Austria. Let's see, Ewald Tscheppe? What is the name?
It's pronounced Tscheppe.
Tscheppe, okay.
Yes.
Beginning with a T, yes. Tell us about that winery and the unusual taste test the winemaker offered you there.
Well, so some of the best visits I've had and some of the best conversations I had with producers were with Ewald. He's really a man who he's super relaxed and super kind of like in tune, almost like a Buddhist monk. I mean, I don't know if I should say this, but very like leveled, very balanced. Just quick anecdote before I get into the taste test. First time I visited him, he was telling me about a 2014 vintage, and he lost something like 90% of his crop. So a huge amount. And I was so saddened to hear this. And I was like, well, how did you deal with this? Did you have to buy grapes? Or he said, no, in the next 2 years, I got more than my average yield. And it all evens up. It's all balanced. And it was such a relaxed response. Like, this is just part of the game. So, and I really appreciated that. And when you hang out with him and when you talk to him, you really get this vibe. As a matter of fact, I have his wine right next to me here, but we'll get into that later.
Yes, please.
So he's a biodynamic grower. He farms according to Demeter rules, probably goes even beyond that, and has a lot of philosophy that he uses when he's farming and when he's making wines.
So no fungicides, pesticides, and so on. It's like beyond organics, biodynamics.
Exactly. So he's using sprays that, are made out of like teas that are basically energized by him, spinning them around with his hand for an hour in one direction and another direction. There's a lot to biodynamics that it's very complex for me to just like kind of explain in a few words.
Sure.
But anyway, we were actually talking about texture in wine. And one of the things that people normally get confused with is that everybody thinks that all of his wines are, because he makes white wines and they're a little darker in color, and people usually think that they're all skin contact /orange/amber wines, whatever you want to call them. And this is not the case. He does make some skin contact orange wines, but not all of them. So majority of them are not. They're just white wines. So we were talking about texture, because you get this texture in his wines that can be confused for tannins and so on. And he was basically saying that he gets this texture in wines because of the way he farms, his biodynamic principles that he uses. And as we were talking about this, he says, oh, hold on one second. I want to do a taste test. So he ran out and grabbed 2 different carrots and didn't tell me what they were. But he just said, taste these carrots. So there we were tasting carrots, 2 of us. And then he told me, he said, 1 carrot is an organic carrot I bought at a market. And then the other one is a biodynamic carrot I bought from a farmer that I know. And he says, which one do you think is a biodynamic carrot? And I guessed correctly. The biodynamic carrot was just, well, firstly, a little more complex in flavor, but also it had this like specific crunch that the other one didn't have. The other one was also delicious, don't get me wrong, but there was definitely a difference.
Oh, wow.
So is it biodynamic farming, or if simply the other carrot was better? I don't know, but it was kind of a cool taste test. And I actually wrote about this when I wrote about Vintners from Styria back in, I think, 2019. So
it's a good way to illustrate texture too, like how it can be expressed in other fruits. Sometimes that's more relatable, but you aced another blind test, obviously.
This was purely luck.
That's great. You mentioned his wine that you have. I don't want to miss tasting that with you. So which 2 wines do you have there with you? Because I'd love to also hear how you taste.
I have 2 wines.
Okay, great.
So one of them is from Ewald Tscheppe. Here it is.
Okay, from Austria. Yeah.
That is his label, has a planet and a tree that grows.
Okay.
Anyway, this is called Ex Vero III. So he grows primarily Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay. And Ex Vero line, he has 3 different Ex Veros. Ex Vero line is always a blend of the 2. It comes from the vineyards that are directly above his house. You can literally see them. And it goes Ex Vero 1 comes from kind of like the bottom, so where you have the most topsoil. Then Ex Vero II is kind of in the middle. And then Ex Vero III comes from what we were talking about in Burgundy, the top of the sides, usually from the soils that are not as rich. So very poor, the vines are struggling a little more. And that is Ex Vero III, exactly.
Oh, well, so that should be the best one, I would think.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
So I opened this last night.
Okay.
So the wine has no added sulfur. It is not filtered or fined.
Okay.
The wines can age beautifully because they have low pH, I believe 2.9 or maybe 3. This is pretty low.
All right.
Bacteria does not like this whatsoever.
Okay.
And higher acidity. This is from 2015, which was warmer vintage. So the wine is a little bit richer. I'm going to pour in my glass and
Yeah, go ahead. Taste.
you'll see the color.
Yep. Oh, yeah. It does look like an orange wine.
So it looks like an orange wine, for
yeah.
sure.
Yeah. And just so you know, I've got 2 Syrahs here. Not that we tried to do a thematic tasting in any way, but they are both from Ontario. And one is from Backyard and one is from Rockway. But yeah, go ahead. Keep telling me about what's in the one that you have there or how it smells to you.
To me, most of the wines from Styria, this very specific taste, kind of almost like a flinty note, if you will. But I think, well, from this part of Styria, I should say, because there are 3 different separate appellations in Styria that are different. But from this part, they have this soil, they call it opok, O-P-O-K.
Okay.
And it's basically marl with a lot of clay.
Oh, okay. Lots of drainage.
So lots of drainage, and that is very good because Styria gets a lot of rain. It is the wettest wine region in Austria.
Oh.
Which also just shows you how dedicated this person is farming biodynamically with all the humidity that he has to deal with. The wine is extremely expressive. It's pretty ripe. As I said, this comes from the most concentrated berries he gets. 2015 also being a warmer vintage. The wine is full of like tropical flavors. I mean, when I write my tasting notes, I definitely give specific fruits and so on because you have to. But I kind of like to, when I'm talking to my friends who like wine, people get intimidated when you tell them like, oh, I'm smelling peach or mango here. But if they don't,
Right. It's true.
I think this is very subjective. It's also depends on what you eat and stuff like that. So a lot of tropical flavors and stone fruit flavors, and also that flintiness that I kind of credit to the soil and the minerality.
Huh. While you're tasting there, is minerality a taste or a texture to you? And take your time there. I'm just pouring my Rockway Syrah from Ontario, and I said I had the Backyard as well. So go ahead, yeah.
I'm kind of glad you're bringing that up. I think minerality, a lot of people will say one or the other. I think it's both. I think it definitely impacts the flavor, but I think it also impacts the texture. Okay. And, this wine to me, although it has a lot of flavor, it's really mostly about texture. It doesn't have tannins, but it has this grip that I think comes from minerality and also the high acid. It's kind of, you feel it, goes over your palate, kind of caresses your palate. And then because of the acidity, you get this like mouth-watering sensation right after you swallow. And the wine just lasts. You can really taste it for like minutes.
Oh, wow. Wow. I don't get technical just by nature. It's not my focus on the wine reviewing, but I just want to say in terms of these 2 Syrahs, I'm finding they have some similarities. They're both full-bodied and smooth. Of course, Syrah usually is. And I think we can do Syrah well in Ontario, even though we're a cool climate. We specialize more in Riesling, Pinot Noir, as you know, Aleks.
Yeah.
But these just have a beautiful sort of velvety mouthfeel. And I do love that texture, mouthfeel, however you want to describe it. It's different from weight, full body, medium, light, but it's just a voluptuousness or something that just, as you say, it caresses your palate. And there's something beautiful about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've actually had some Syrahs from cooler climates. I think when done well, they can really work. I think the grape can take it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Syrah is definitely one of those grapes that really shows that it was grown in a cooler climate or a warmer climate, depending.
It does, doesn't it? Wow. Lots of dark fruit here. Again, not getting into my fruit salad bowl just right now, but I'll just keep it at a high level. Beautiful. Dark fruit and even some dried tea leaves or something there. So it's dried herbs, maybe more like it. There's something savory about these Syrahs that I'm really liking.
I was just going to say also about my wine, now on the second taste, the aftertaste is almost salty.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and I think I love when I taste this in food The other wine that I have is definitely saltier, but I love when I get this in wine because I think it matches when you're eating food. Like that really helps out.
Especially if it's making your mouth water. What is the other wine that you have there?
The other wine I have is I've never covered this region before, and I'm kind of sad about it. This comes from Carso or Karst, depending on which side of the border you are. So this is northeast Italy, right above Venice, right on the border with Slovenia. So this is a historically really interesting area because you have a lot of Slovenian people living in this area in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because a little bit of history. After World War II, President Tito of Yugoslavia basically gave a little part of the land to the Italians. And so these Slovenians stayed on the other side of the border. So what's interesting is that all these Slovenians basically make the wine the same way. They went back to the roots and they're all making wines without adding anything. So natural wines, if you will. A lot of them are making white wines with skin contact, so orange wines or amber wines, whatever you want to call them. And this is from a guy, his name is Benjamin Zecevic. So Zecevic is anything that ends with ich, just like my last name, is usually Slavic last name.
Okay.
So not Italian at all. As a matter of fact, if you go to his website, you would say in Italian, welcome. So bienvenute, I think, is in Italian, and also dobrodošli, which is in Slovenian, welcome.
Okay.
And this is from a grape called Vitovska, which is a indigenous grape of the area and kind of like the signature grape of the winery. It's pretty neutral, so it's really able to show where it comes from. And the soils in Carso or in Karst, it's basically limestone soil, but a very specific limestone with a lot of calcium and a lot of iron. So it's kind of reddish.
Okay.
And if you compare it, for example, Gromner, who's in a similar area, but really more in Friuli, in Collio than in Carso, soil is different. The wines are bigger. Zecevic makes these wines that are very light. So this is only 12% alcohol. And it's a skin contact wine, but as you can tell, it
looks orange again.
It's definitely orange, but it's a little bit lighter. Yeah. It's lighter in color than Werlitsch, who does not have skin contact.
Wow.
So this is because of Vitovska as the variety, but also because of that soil. And the wine is just very mineral, very salty, a lot of like chalk. Again, it's not really about the fruit. This is really also a lot about the texture.
That sounds so good. Wow. I'm really enjoying the Rockway. These wines are changing.
I chose these two because, Zecevic being one of my really favorite producers, and also Werlitsch because we were talking about him, but also because I wanted to show that color can be deceiving. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. And going back to my wine origin speech that I gave earlier, I think wine should be mostly about taste, not about what you see in your glass. Of course, if it's a beautiful color, it helps, especially when we're posting on Instagram. But
yeah. But wine's more than Instagram, thank goodness. So while we're tasting, I don't want to skip over this. You had a really interesting podcast about hybrids on Vintners podcast. Just at a high level, how do they differ from Vitis vinifera? Vitis vinifera, we think of Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay. But hybrids, like we have here in Ontario, Baco Noir is a cross between, I think it's Cinsault and Pinot Noir, if I remember correctly. Someone will correct me if I'm not. But what's the key difference? Why are some grapes named hybrids? They've obviously been crossed, but so have Vitis vinifera grapes. They're originally crossings of some sort. Like Cabernet, I think you mentioned in the podcast, is actually Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc. It's a combination.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it doesn't get called a hybrid.
Yeah, so hybrids are normally called all the varieties that are crossings of Vitis vinifera and another type of vine. So, I don't know, it can be a vine variety from North America or whatnot. So it's usually a Vitis vinifera and a non-vinifera variety that is crossed, and those are called hybrids.
I see. So instead of two royals marrying each other, it was a royal and a commoner, and they probably, have a more interesting marriage.
I'm sure a lot of Europeans would like this comparison. I think Vitis vinifera is the most commonly used variety that we use for winemaking, at least.
Okay.
And because it was dominant in Europe for centuries. Other varieties come from, Asia or North America, South America or whatnot. And we didn't have a huge culture of winemaking in these areas,
Right.
So this is why we think of Vitis vinifera as being the best.
The classic or the noble. They were self-appointed, I guess. They're just more from the classic wine regions of Bordeaux and
Exactly.
France. Yeah. Okay.
So, I don't know if I would call them the royals, maybe, sure.
No, probably bad comparison. But I was trying to figure out something. Yeah.
I think it's a good comparison because what are the royals? They're just human as
That's
we are.
true. And they're getting in just as much trouble as everybody else these days. So anyway, yes. But
Exactly. So I think because of the culture and history, we appreciate Vitis vinifera more, but also because we have more experience with Vitis vinifera varieties. And over centuries, we've learned how to deal with them, how to make them, how to produce them. But, with climate change increasing problems that growers are facing in the vineyards with humidity, with heat, and so on, the hybrid grapes are definitely getting more and more popular. And also, especially in certain cooler regions, like, as you mentioned, Ontario or Vermont. One of the people I was talking to in my podcast was Deirdre Heiken from La Garagista in Vermont. And, Vermont is a place that is known for cheeses and skiing and stuff like this. It's not really famous for winemaking, but she's doing an incredible job. And she's really focusing on these hybrid varieties because it is easier for her to farm them and to ripen them in Vermont because of their resistance. Now, their resistance to, fungal diseases or so on is not 100%. You still have to spray these varieties, but you have to spray them way less than you spray a Vitis vinifera variety. I don't remember exactly if we mentioned this in the podcast, but I've also talked to a lot of people after the podcast about this. And one thing with Vitis vinifera is that over the years, people were taking the best clones, the vines, the plant material that was producing the best grapes. And so if you imagine, there's not a lot of crossing, and it's basically just clone after clone, which kind of lowers the immune system of the plant itself.
Right. Inbreeding, again, back to royals. It's like if you don't get out of the family, that's not a good thing either.
Exactly. And that's a great comparison.
Now it works.
This is one of the reasons why Vitis vinifera is so more prone to getting these diseases and having problems and being finicky.
That's interesting.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So you've got more biodiversity in the vineyards. They're healthier rootstocks because they've been crossed with other not in the family kind of vines. Are they more resistant to extreme cold, heat, and fungal diseases? All three? Like, can they deal with all the extremes?
So they're all designed for different things. I mean, They were basically designed by humans. They were PV varieties.
What's PV?
So basically, PV is a fungal resistant varieties, and it was developed in Germany. It is an abbreviation, but in German, and my German is not great, and I'm not going to butcher now the name, but everybody can Google it. It's PIWI, so PV.
Okay.
And they were designed so people can grow grapes in cooler regions and regions that are wet, that get a lot of rain. But some of them are obviously better for drought. But also, I think with the drought, this is just a big problem for wine growing in general.
It is. So if they're not as thirsty as vines, that's good for the environment as well in terms of just the demands.
Exactly.
I mean, especially when we hear of vineyards like Australia and California, they have such problems with drought, and the ground is getting so salty because it's just concentrating year after year, becoming more saline. So, and then I know in Canada, we have a lot of hybrids, even like, say, in Nova Scotia, where a lot of German and Austrian winemakers immigrated to. They use Sèvres Blanc and all kinds of different hybrids there because it's really cold, the climate there. So makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And I think hybrid grapes get kind of bad reputation. I think wine professionals generally are now thinking more about them because I think they're getting a bad rap, but I think they're an answer to the climate change and also to being more environmentally responsible. Just, by default, you don't have to spray them as often. You don't have to use harmful chemicals.
Yeah.
And they're easier to farm. So,
and even just diversity of taste too. Like, it's not just environmental. I've had some great Baco Noirs, like from Henry of Pelham, and it's, it's more diversity in taste. Like, it's just, if you're tired of your Cabernet, that's just, you're in a rut. I think it's really great to branch out and try some of these different wines for different tastes and different dishes, the pairings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things when you and I talked, you mentioned that you liked my comparison with the Jimi Hendrix.
Yes. Tell us about that one.
This is actually something that I use a lot in life in general. I love music a lot, and I think Jimi Hendrix is one of the best guitarists ever. And most of guitars are designed for people who are right-handed, just like any other things. And Jimi Hendrix was left-handed. So he didn't have a left-handed guitar. He just flipped his guitar the other way around. He was basically playing it upside down.
Oh, that's so
cool. If we're always following the rules of like, you have to play the guitar this way, or you have to grow your wines this way, or you have to make your wines this way, or wine has to look a certain way, going back to my wine origin thing.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have Jimi Hendrix. You wouldn't have wine from Werlitsch, which is absolutely stunning. You probably wouldn't have Domaine del Romane Conti either, because they're very natural and they're biodynamic also. Yes. By the way, one of the most expensive wines in the world are biodynamic and natural in the way that they're made.
Wow. And I can see right in back of you, you've got that passion for wine, and you actually collect vinyl records while we're talking about Jimi Hendrix.
Yes.
Do you have any vinyl records from him as well?
Absolutely.
Oh, you do? Okay. So
I think one of the first records I bought was Jimi Hendrix and Miles Davis. Miles Davis was the first record I bought because it was $5 at a flea market in Williamsburg.
Wow.
And I just got my first record player at the time. Then later I built on. But yes, definitely. I have, I think, 4 records from Jimi Hendrix.
Oh, my goodness. Because I can see you've got your bar next to all your vinyl records there in the back. I love that. Like, without getting too off track in a wine podcast, but what is it about vinyl that you like over, say, digital recordings? What comes through to you?
There's something romantic about having a record player and putting a record on and hearing a little bit of that, that noise, the vinyl. Yes, exactly. Yeah. But also, a lot of people will tell you that listening to music on vinyl, if you have a good surround system, if you have a good record player, good speakers, good amp, and so on, that produces a better quality sound than if you're listening to your music on Spotify. And to me, I love music so much, and I basically noticed what people were saying to be true. And, my parents had a big vinyl collection when I was growing up. And because of space and everything, with 2 children living in Belgrade during the embargo and the war and everything that was going on there, they kind of like took all their records, they gave them to my grandparents. The records were in an attic, and, attic kind of at one point was letting some rain come through, and most of their records got ruined. And it was heartbreaking to me. So I, at one point, moving here, I wanted to kind of rebuild a collection, to have a collection of my own that I could pass to hopefully one day my children, or my brother's children, or whoever. I do have some of the records that I was able to save for my parents' collection.
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
That's lovely.
Most of them I purchased.
Well, that just reminds me, when you talk about the little crackling and whatever, it reminds me of back to our wine. Hopefully it's not too much of a stretch, but that whole thing about texture, and especially from an unfiltered, unfined wine, it's got more crackly bits. There's something about the experience that's, I don't know, a bit more hands-on, tactile, tangible. But anyway, I love that. You put the two together.
For sure. I think it brings a little more soul and a little more human into everything we do, because nowadays we're so connected.
Filtered, and everything needs to be perfect. Yeah.
Exactly. I have like a huge problem, for example, when I'm trying to watch a movie. There's so many options. You go on Netflix and you have gazillion of movies, and it's hard. Back in the day, you had your DVDs, or you had what was playing on TV, and that was it. And you couldn't choose.
And everybody talked about the same things. Now,
exactly.
No one has anything to talk about. No, we still have wine. But I also don't want to forget, we need to talk about your new startup, Vintners.co, a new website. Tell us what that's about and what people would find there, why they'd want to go, who would want to go there, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. It's actually just like all other wine-related things. During the pandemic, I was hanging out with my neighbor at the time, Roland Benedetti, who is a co-founder of Vintners, and he came up with this idea. And I was working at Wine Spectator and then kind of like transitioning to Sotheby's at the time. But I always had this in the back of my mind because he told me about the idea. And finally, together with his partner, Eric Barocca, who's based in Paris, They founded Vintners in the fall of last year, 2021.
Okay.
And I think apart from, developers, I was the first person that they hired, maybe even the first, I'm not sure. But the idea is to build a B2B platform, so only business to business, no consumers.
Okay.
And basically the platform would connect wine producers with wine importers / wine distributors, and also professional wine buyers. When I say professional wine buyers, I mean people who buy wine for restaurants or wine shops or hotels or whatever.
Sure.
And basically, it's a marketplace. So as a producer, you can put out your whole portfolio on this marketplace, and you can sell, depending where you are. If you're in Europe, you can sell. If you're in the EU, you can sell to most EU countries directly using our platform. So if a restaurant in Paris, for example, wants to buy a wine from Alto Adige, for example, Gravu, who was another guest of ours on Hybrid podcast, we sold some of his wines in Paris directly. But also you can find an importer in the US if you don't have one, or you can work with your importer if you already have one in the US or Canada or wherever you are. And so your importer, now I'm going to go to this tier, basically your importer or distributor can buy wine through the platform from the producers. They can also find new producers, but they can collaborate basically with all the producers they have in their portfolio. And, they can put all the wines they have in their portfolio, they can list them on the platform. And then people, I'm moving now to the next tier, people from restaurants and wine shops can go in there and purchase wines from these importers or directly from the producers. So that's one of the things that the platform does. The project is very ambitious. Another thing is that, I've noticed this doing my research about wine when I'm writing, but also, Roland and Eric also noticed this, the co-founders. Wine information is something that is very valuable. And a lot of times in the wine industry, you go on one website and it says one thing about a wine. You go on another website, it says another thing about wine. Mm-hmm. The idea with Vintners is that the producer would post the information about their wine, about their winery, and everybody who is basically a stakeholder in the winery, so if they're selling the wine or if they're buying the wine, they can check this information and it's consistent from point A to point C. So the wine information is also very important to us. A third thing that we also want to allow is management of allocations. We were talking earlier about Domaine della Romane Conti and their allocations.
Right.
So for example, they could easily manage their allocations, who they're going to with the inventory tracker and everything through Vintners Go. People like Werlitsch, who, both Werlitsch and Zecevic have only 8 hectares of vineyards, very tiny productions. So if they wanted to manage their allocations and see where their wine is going, they could also manage this. And another final thing, I think, and very important for us, is that a lot of times the producer kind of, once they sell the wine to importers, once it goes to another market, if it doesn't go directly to a restaurant, they don't know where the wine is sold, if it's sold at a business that they want it to be sold. So one of the things that we want to provide is this visibility. So everybody knows, what happens with this product.
Right.
And the whole platform is designed for craft wine producers.
Okay. So small artisanal kind of
Exactly.
producers. Yeah.
So craft wine is a term that we don't really use in the wine industry. And I don't know why. We were actually wondering, because you see it in beer industry. You have a craft beer or craft spirits.
Yes.
And it's basically anything that comes from, an independent producer produced in small quantities. And it's usually produced with a lot of care, with a lot of room for innovation and making experiments with your product and with your wine. So, we didn't want to use, this is something that a lot of people would say, oh, well, that sounds like natural wine. However, I think natural wine term, even though I use it a lot and I drink a lot of natural wine, I think it can be a little bit limiting, because I think there are a lot of artisanal producers out there that wouldn't fall into the category of being natural producers, but have been making wine the same way their great-great-great-great-father was making. I'm looking at Germany, for example, because German Riesling, you block the malolactic fermentation with sulfur normally, and this is not allowed in natural winemaking, even though natural wine is not really defined, but normally wine has to go through malolactic fermentation.
Okay.
So it can be a little bit excluding. So we're using the term craft wine, and I think it suits exactly the people that we're trying to target.
Oh, that sounds like a great project, great platform, especially for your smaller producers who don't have that kind of infrastructure and technology to do all of that, what you're providing for them. So that
Yeah,
sounds
exactly.
amazing. Another great project, Aleks. You do keep yourself busy.
Yes.
So where can we get in touch with you? Of course, there's vintners.co. How else can we find you online?
Well, I'm mostly on Instagram in terms of social media. I don't use Twitter or Facebook. I mean,
Okay.
I have accounts on those platforms, but I really do not post anything.
We'll link to you and your website in the show notes. We'll put links to the wines you mentioned as well, because I'm sure people will be curious as to what you're referring to and to find you online. But anything else you want to mention before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered
We covered a
everything,
lot,
even
yeah.
things that I didn't plan to talk about. But
Which makes it interesting. No, I loved your
yes,
stories. Really good, Aleks. So,
thank you.
well, thank you for spending time with us here, and I really appreciate it. And I look forward to our next chat on your podcast. So I'll say goodbye for now, but have a great rest of your day, Aleks.
You as well. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Aleks. Here are my takeaways. I thought Alex's explanation of how minerality affects both flavor and texture was really helpful. 2, wines made from hybrid grapes will increasingly become part of our drinking menu, both due to climate change as well as their improved taste and diversity of flavors. And 3, I loved Aleks' tip on what winemakers can learn from Jimi Hendrix. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, the full transcript of my conversation with Aleks, links to his podcast and website, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my free ultimate guide to wine and food pairing. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/206. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or want to be a beta reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when I chat with David Garrett, who is the co-founder of Club de Vin, a global non-fungible token NFT wine club. We'll chat about how this new technology and others are changing the wine world. In the meantime, if you missed episode 54, go back and take a listen. I talk about what minerality in wine means to me, as well as the California wine fires. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. What is minerality when it comes to wine? Is it a taste, a feeling, or some bogus concept meant to keep wine mysterious? What's the latest with the devastating wildfires in Sonoma wine country, and how will that impact the wines we drink? Why are winemakers wary of cannabis producers? It's not what you might think. And what is a new wine group doing to help with a balanced life? That's exactly what we'll be learning on today's episode of the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. If you like this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week, perhaps a wine with great minerality. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.